Podcasting isn't easy. It takes a lot of work every week for us to consistently put out episodes. And the most helpful thing that we can outsource is the podcast editing. There are countless podcast editors that you can find that can help you edit your show and likely do an even better job editing than you can and improve the overall quality and the overall experience for your listeners while saving you a ton of that valuable time. So in this video, I'm going to share 6 really important tips for hiring your podcast editor. Let's get to it. Hey, welcome to the Pod Sound School. We are podcast producers. We're podcast editors ourselves. I'm Studio Steve. I'm an audio engineer and an all-around podcast nerd. If this is your first time to our channel, welcome. Consider subscribing. We post new videos every week that are really fun, all about podcasting, content creation, and taking your online presence to the next level. Okay, so let's get right to the 6 tips that you can put into practice that are going to really give you good results from hiring your podcast editor. Okay, let's start with tip number 1. So for tip number 1, the first thing is let's do a recording quality check. Before we are going to get anybody else involved, it's important for us to make sure that the audio we're recording to begin with sounds the best that it can. Maybe you've heard the expression garbage in, garbage out, or a favorite of mine, you can polish a turd, but it's still just a piece of shit. If we share a really bad sounding audio file with an editor to work on, there's really nothing they can do, no matter their level of expertise. The best editors in the world are still not going to be able to make a really bad sounding recording sound good. So I have a video right here, how you can improve the sound quality of your podcast that talks about just that. Number 2, pick a service or find the editor. There are tons of places you can go to find podcast editors. The most popular are Fiverr and Upwork. I really like Upwork a lot. I've had really good results using Upwork. Also, you can just Google podcast editing or podcast editing services, and there are a lot of great companies that come up too. There is weeditpodcast.com that has a really good reputation, and also PodLab and different companies like that where they have a team of editors. So you have a lot of different options. And number 3, ask for a portfolio or examples of their work. After you find an editor on Fiverr or Upwork or even multiple editors that you want to start a conversation with, before you get too deep into the conversation, ask for an example of their work. That's an immediate indicator of whether or not they're able to provide a good quality sounding podcast. Number 4, schedule a video call. I really would recommend this. I think it's a really good idea to get your new podcast editor onto a video call with you so you can vibe out their personality and see if this is somebody that you feel comfortable maybe having uncomfortable conversations with, like when they apply an effect you don't like or when they do something you don't like. Is this somebody you're going to be able to communicate effectively with? And this brings us perfectly to number 5, and that is know the lingo and talk the shop. So we're here on the video call, we're here communicating with the podcast editor. Here is where it can be really important to understand some basic audio production terminology and how the tools that podcast editors use, how they work and what some of the names are of these tools so that you can ask them some very important questions. These are the exact questions that I've asked our podcast editors that we've hired and that work for the Pod Sound School, and they work really well to just kind of get to know your podcast editor and to understand their level of experience. We want to ensure that we're actually working with an audio professional, somebody who has at least some education, who has educated themselves, who uses good quality equipment. So here is a list of questions. Now, I will also leave these questions in the description right where you're watching this video. So if you want to go copy and paste those, you can have those for yourself when you are interviewing your podcast editor. Now, some of these terms might scare you. They might be the whole reason you're hiring an editor anyways, so that you don't have to learn about some of these big audio words like compression and limiting and de-essing and all of that. But it's important that you start talking the lingo and that you get a basic understanding of what these things are and how podcasts even sound good to begin with. What tools do podcast editors use to make their podcast sound good? So here's the first question that I ask a podcast editor. Absolutely. And that is, what DAW do you use? Okay, now the second thing I would ask, because I would just have to know, is what noise reduction solution do you use? Noise reduction is really important, and it's something that you're going to want your podcast editor to apply on your mixes especially if they have noise. But using dynamic microphones that need a lot of gain, we usually always have a little buzz that comes from our electronics, a little buzz that comes from our USB microphone, or we have some computer buzz that's being picked up because we're recording into a computer and our microphone's right next to a computer. So noise reduction helps with those kind of things. Now, there's only a few more kind of processes or plugins or effects that they are going to be using that I just have to find out about. And a big one for me is compression. Now, I'm an audio engineer, so I really care about compression. You might not really care about compression. You might not ever want to talk about it or hear about it if you're anything like Veronica. Compression is really important. Simply put, what it does is it makes what's quieter louder and what's louder quieter. It squeezes and compresses your voice into a more manageable little chunk that sounds really fat and juicy and comes through and sounds professional, especially when a good compressor is being used. Okay, now, of course, I couldn't even think about hiring this person unless I could talk with them about EQ. EQ? Oh, come on, Studio Steve, don't make me talk about EQ. Let's talk about EQ for a minute. It's not that bad. It's not going to hurt you. So EQ basically is just how we can color and really correct some of the nasty noises that happen in our sound. So EQ stands for equalization, and it really has to do with the color or the frequencies of the sound. But a good question to ask here is, hey, what type of EQ do you like to do your podcast voices? And then, of course, the other thing I would talk about with EQ is an effect that is in the same class as EQ, and that's a de-esser. So you could ask, do you have a de-esser that you like to use? I have a very sibilant voice, and some of my guests that I have on have a very sibilant voice. Do you ever use a de-esser? And a de-esser, as you guessed, is just something that helps to subdue those harsh S noises. It's a really cool effect, so definitely ask them if they use that as well too. And then finally, you'll probably want to discuss limiting and mastering. So do you use a limiter? What kind of mastering effects do you use? Things of that nature will really get a fun conversation going. And then finally, you would end the conversation or have already talked about some of the specific things that you want from your podcast. So do you remove filler words, ums and uhs? Do you charge extra to add music? I want a lot of sound effects. Do you have access to a sound effects library? What do I need to provide you with so that you can edit my vision, whatever it is? You'll be happy you had these conversations, and you'll be happy you set aside some time yourself to learn about some of these things. You can talk the shop. That way, when you do get a mix back from an editor that you're not so happy with, you'll be able to communicate more precisely to them what you don't like. Okay, so here we are at point 6. The last thing, and this is just to test the waters. So here it's important to have some episodes ready. Record yourself a nice batch of episodes that you can test new podcast editors with. It's not even a bad idea to work with 2 or 3 podcast editors at the same time and give each of them an episode to work on to see which one you like the best, which work you really hear the vision of your podcast coming through. And don't be afraid to get confrontational and just say that it's not working after you have tried an episode. If it's not working for you, if you don't like how it sounds, if you didn't like the experience, then just cut it off right there and save yourself further trouble in the future. So it's good to just say, let's do a test episode. Here's a G Drive link I have, or here's how I'm going to share this file with you. And how long is it going to take you to give it back to me? What is your turnaround time? Figure out what their turnaround time is, and if they give you an episode back that sounds really good and it was on time when they said their turnaround time would be, then that's a really good sign, and you can keep testing a few more episodes. And that's it, Podski. You're ready to hire yourself a podcast editor. And as I mentioned before, we are podcast editors ourselves, but that is not a service we directly offer. However, I do teach a really cool course all about podcast editing. So if you would like to really become a good podcast editor, check that out. You can find out more information by going to podsoundschool.com/R4P. Stands for Reaper for podcasters. Reaper, or Reaper.fm, is a really great audio editing software, or DAW, really great solution for independent podcasters and independent podcast editors. It's designed like a lot of the professional applications like Pro Tools. So if you ever want to learn Pro Tools after learning Reaper, the transition is very simple. And that's it for me today. Let us know about your progress. And like I mentioned, please comment here if you have any questions. let's say you have talked to your podcast editor and they told you what compressor they used or what DAW they used, and I didn't list it here in this video, I would happily answer your questions about that and lead you in any direction that you need to be led into. We are here to see your podcast become a success. We want to see your online content go places, and we know that podcasting is one of the most effective ways to build a brand and to stand out online. So thanks so much for tuning in today. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and check in next week to see what crazy fun podcasting video we'll be posting. And until next time, the same two things we always say: do your homework and happy casting. Excuse me, the air vent just turned on. Sorry for that. I'm going to go turn it off and resume recording. Okay, I just turned the air off. Sorry about that. Speaking of noise reduction, can you hear that vent? Come on, air, turn off already. There it goes. Okay.